Welcome back to Rapture Tales. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and get ready for another story you won't forget. Let's dive back to the story. Rain tapped steadily against the narrow glass panes of a little flower shop on Alder Street, the kind of soft coastal rain that never seemed to begin or end, only exist. Inside, warm yellow lights softened the grey day and turned the air golden against the petals stacked along the wooden counter. Clara Bennett's fingers moved carefully through a bundle of cream ranunculus, trimming each stem to equal height, not because customers would notice, but because she would. The bell above the door rang. She didn't look up immediately. She already knew the timing. Friday. 5 minutes before closing. Exactly as always. The man entered without shaking the umbrella, which meant he had waited outside under the awning first. Clara allowed herself a small smile before turning around. Ethan Rose stood just inside the door, tall, coat still damp at the shoulders, dark hair brushed back imperfectly as if the wind had rearranged it during the walk. He didn't browse. He never browsed. His eyes always found the same display, the single white roses placed in a narrow glass cylinder near the register. "You're late," she said gently. 4 minutes, he replied. Traffic light refused to cooperate. She wrapped the rose before he asked. He watched her hands more than the flower. He had done that every week for 11 months, never explaining the reason for the purchase. Not for a girlfriend. Not for a grave. Not for decoration. He never carried it out visibly either, always tucked into the inner fold of his coat. "Still not telling me where they go?" she asked, finally deciding curiosity deserved one more attempt. He held her gaze this time instead of dodging it. "They go somewhere important," he said. It was the first time his answer changed. Something in his tone carried weight, not sadness, not romance, something deliberate. Clara felt it before she understood it. He paid, but instead of leaving, he lingered as thunder rolled faintly out over the ocean. "Storm's getting worse," he added. "I live upstairs," she said. "I'll survive." He glanced toward the narrow staircase at the back of the shop, then toward the rain intensifying outside. "Power may go out. You shouldn't be alone tonight." It wasn't protective, it was matter-of-fact. Like he was stating a logistical issue. "Are you offering to stay?" she asked lightly. "I'm offering to fix the wiring that sparked last week," he replied. She blinked. She hadn't told him that. He noticed. "You mentioned the lights flickering when I paid," he clarified. "Right." She had forgotten she'd said it aloud. The storm knocked electricity out across 3 blocks within the hour. The shop dimmed into candlelight that Clara kept for evening ambience, transforming familiar shelves into warm shadow. Ethan removed his coat and rolled his sleeves without ceremony, already examining the fuse box as though he belonged in the space. They ate leftover lemon bread from the cafe next door while he worked. No music, only rain and occasional thunder. Silence sat comfortably between them, strangely comfortable for two people who technically only shared weekly transactions. "You never ask personal questions," she finally said. "You never volunteer personal answers," he replied. "That's fair." Another pause. Then, unexpectedly, "Do you trust patterns?" he asked. She frowned slightly. "In flowers?" "In people?" She thought longer this time. "Yes. People repeat themselves even when they don't want to." He looked at her then with a focus sharper than before. "Good," he said quietly. The lights returned. Neither of them moved immediately. For the first time in 11 months, he did not leave right away after buying the rose. And for the first time, Clara realized she didn't want him to. He began visiting outside Fridays after that night, not frequently, but predictably. Small repairs appeared completed before she noticed them. A door hinge stopped sticking, the upstairs window sealed against drafts, the leaking sink no longer dripped at 3 a.m. He never announced he would come. He simply arrived when needed. Ivy Bennett noticed first. "You trust him too easily," her younger sister said from behind a tower of peonies one afternoon. "I don't trust him," Clara answered. "I just don't distrust him." That's worse. But their mother Ruth watched Ethan differently. Not suspicious, measuring. "Careful men rarely attach themselves without purpose," she said after he left one evening. "Maybe he likes flowers," Clara offered. Ruth shook her head slowly. "No. He likes stability." Weeks later, under a sky filled with drifting lanterns from the Harbour Festival, Ethan asked Clara to walk with him after closing. The waterfront shimmered gold across dark water, crowds distant enough to blur into background noise. He didn't kneel. He didn't prepare a speech. He simply handed her the 12th white rose. "I don't buy these for memory," he said. "I buy them to measure time. A year is long enough to know consistency isn't coincidence." She didn't understand yet, not fully, but she felt the gravity of it. "I want to build a life that stays predictable," he continued. "With you. No dramatic confession. No declarations of eternal passion. Just certainty." And strangely, that certainty moved her more than romance would have. "Yes," she whispered. He slid a ring onto her finger as lantern light drifted overhead, not extravagant, but precise, as though chosen for durability rather than appearance. From the edge of the pier, a man leaned silently against the railing watching them, Marcus Hale, expression unreadable before he turned and disappeared into the crowd without being noticed. Their wedding took place quietly at the city registry office 2 months later. Only Clara's family attended. Ethan claimed his relatives lived overseas and avoided travel. No photos from his side existed. No objections arose, only a faint unease Ruth could not name. The clerk stamped the certificate. Ethan folded it himself and kept it. "I'll handle filing," he said smoothly. Married life began simply, then changed faster than sense allowed. Within 3 weeks, Ethan relocated them into a refined apartment overlooking the marina. Too expensive for an architecture consultant, he explained promotions, partnerships, expanding contracts. Logical explanations delivered calmly enough that questions felt almost rude. But rules appeared gently. He preferred managing finances alone. He discouraged unexpected visits to his office because of confidentiality agreements. He worked irregular hours that never aligned with project deadlines Clara heard mentioned in passing. Nothing dramatic. Nothing provable. Just patterns slightly off rhythm. Then the invitation arrived. Addressed formally, Mrs. Clara rode to a charity gala she had never heard of, hosted by people who apparently knew her husband very well. And that night, inside a ballroom of polished marble and quiet wealth, 3 different investors greeted Ethan not as an architect, but as a partner. Clara smiled politely beside him, while somewhere across the room, a woman in emerald silk watched her with sharp, assessing interest. The woman approached slowly. "You've been married long?" she asked, eyes fixed on Clara's ring rather than her face. Before Clara could answer, Ethan's hand tightened slightly at her back. "Camille," he said smoothly, "I didn't expect you tonight." But the woman only smiled, the kind of smile that suggested ownership rather than greeting. And for the first time since the lanterns over the harbor, Clara felt something quietly begin to fracture, not loudly, not visibly. Just enough to hear, if one listened carefully. Perfect, continuing directly from the moment Clara meets Camille at the gala. The orchestra softened into a slower arrangement as waiters drifted between guests carrying trays of crystal glasses. Conversations layered over one another in polite tones that never quite reached laughter. Clara noticed something immediately unsettling. Nobody asked Ethan what he did. They spoke to him like they already knew. Like they were careful with him. Camille Voss didn't break eye contact. Up close she was even more composed than Clara first thought. Not the obvious glamour many wealthy women wore like armor, but a precision, every movement deliberate, every expression measured before displayed. She held her glass by the stem without looking down at it, her posture relaxed in a way that required practice rather than comfort. "You didn't mention you remarried," Camille said calmly, though the statement was clearly directed at Ethan, not Clara. "It wasn't relevant to business," Ethan replied. "Business. Not personal." Clara felt the word land oddly in her chest. Camille's gaze returned to Clara again. "How long?" "Almost 3 months," Clara answered before Ethan could intervene this time. A silence followed, brief but heavy enough to notice. Something shifted in Camille's eyes, not surprise, not anger. Calculation. "Well," Camille said at last, raising her glass slightly toward Clara, "you've stepped into a very complicated life." Ethan's hand tightened subtly at Clara's back again. "Not painful. Not affectionate either. A signal. Camille manages events for most of the investors here," he explained evenly. "And you manage Ethan." Camille added lightly. Clara smiled politely. "No. We don't manage each other." Camille held her gaze another second too long, then nodded as though filing the answer away for later use. Across the room, Marcus Hale stood speaking with two board members but watching them in the reflection of a mirrored column. When Ethan noticed him, Marcus lifted his glass slightly, not greeting, more acknowledgement, before turning back to his conversation. The music resumed louder, dissolving the moment. But Clara knew something had just happened. She simply didn't know what. On the drive home, the city lights slid across the windshield in long reflections broken by rain. Ethan drove in silence longer than usual, hands steady on the wheel. "You never said you had partners," Clara finally said gently. "I have investors." "They called you partner." He didn't answer immediately. Titles vary depending on context. Another careful sentence. She studied him in profile. "And Camille?" "A vendor," he replied. Too quickly. Clara leaned back into the seat. She looked at me like she knew something I didn't. "People in that circle analyze everything," he said. "It's habit, not meaning." The explanation was reasonable. Almost perfectly reasonable. Which unsettled her more than a strange one would have. 2 mornings later, Clara arrived downstairs to open the shop and found the front door already unlocked. Inside, a man stood examining a display of winter orchids, tall, silver-haired, dressed simply but precisely. Not browsing. Studying. He turned as she entered. "Clara Bennett?" he asked. "Yes." He extended a card instead of a hand. "Leonard Graves, legal consultant. I apologize for the intrusion," he said calmly. "I needed to confirm something in person." "About flowers?" she asked, confused. His eyes moved briefly around the shop, then returned to her ring. "No," he said quietly. "About your marriage." The bell above the door rang again before she could respond. Naomi from the cafe next door walked in carrying fresh pastries, stopping when she sensed the tension. "Everything okay?" Naomi asked. Leonard slipped his card onto the counter. "I'll return at a better time." He left without explaining further. Clara stared at the card. Her phone buzzed simultaneously, a message from Ethan, "Working late tonight. Don't wait up." The timing unsettled her more than the words. That evening the rain returned heavier than before. Ivy studied Leonard's card across the kitchen table. "Legal consultant doesn't visit random flower shops," her sister muttered. "Maybe wrong address." "He knew your name." Clara traced the engraved letters slowly. "He said he needed to confirm my marriage." Ruth looked up from her sewing, needle paused mid-air. "Then someone has questioned it." The thought hung quietly in the room. Not accusation. Not fear. Just possibility. And for the first time since the registry office stamp months ago. Clara realized she had never actually seen the filed certificate again. Ethan had kept it. The next day, she visited his office unannounced. Not to confront. Just to see. The receptionist greeted her politely but with a flicker of uncertainty before calling upstairs. After a pause, she offered a careful smile. "Mr. Rowe is in a meeting across town," she said. Clara nodded, but as she turned to leave, a door down the corridor opened. Voices inside. Marcus Hale stepped out mid-conversation, stopping short when he saw her. For half a second, genuine surprise crossed his face before it smoothed into charm. "Clara," he said warmly. "Ethan didn't mention you were coming." "I was nearby," she replied. Marcus hesitated, a rare break in his usual confidence, then casually closed the office door behind him a little too quickly. Through the narrowing gap, Clara glimpsed the conference table. 2 wine glasses. And Camille Voss seated at the far end. The door clicked shut. Marcus smiled wider than necessary. "Business planning," he said lightly, but Clara noticed he never invited her inside. That night, Ethan returned home later than any night before, and for the first time since she had known him. He did not bring a white rose. And she noticed. Because the absence meant the pattern had changed. And Ethan Rowe was a man built entirely on patterns. Great, I'll continue the story forward from the rising tension. We are now entering the second half of the story, where truths begin surfacing and events move toward the central moment. My husband celebrated with his mistress, so I walked in with a man she forgot to divorce. Still written continuously, no chapter labels, picking up directly after Ethan stops bringing the white rose. Clara did not ask him about the missing rose. She waited. Patterns mattered to Ethan, and silence revealed more than confrontation ever could. The next morning, She opened the shop earlier than usual. Fog from the harbor still clung to the streets, and only delivery trucks moved through the quiet. She had just finished arranging lilies when the bell chimed softly. Leonard Graves returned. This time he carried a thin leather folder. "I prefer conversations before situations become public," he said gently. Clara folded her hands on the counter. "Then please stop speaking in fragments." He studied her face, measuring readiness rather than emotion. "Are you legally married to Ethan Rowe?" he asked, "under the name Clara Bennett, with certificate filed 3 months ago at City Registry Office 12. "Yes." He opened the folder and placed a document in front of her. Another marriage certificate. Different name. Different date. Camille Voss, spouse of Ethan Rowe. Filed 2 years prior. Still active. The room felt strangely silent, as though sound itself hesitated. "That's impossible," Clara said automatically. Leonard didn't argue. "He never finalized the divorce," he replied calmly. "Which makes you, legally, not his wife." Clara's fingers tightened on the counter edge, but she did not cry, not yet, because disbelief arrived before pain. "Why tell me?" she asked quietly. Leonard met her eyes. "Because my client is Camille Voss." The words landed harder than the document. "She asked you to hurt me." "No," he said. "She asked me to locate you." A pause. "She doesn't know you exist." That night Clara didn't confront Ethan. Instead, she observed. He cooked dinner, rare, explaining a successful investment closing. His mood was controlled but lighter, as if pressure had lifted somewhere outside her awareness. "Celebration this weekend," he mentioned casually. "Corporate expansion." "Formal?" she asked. "Yes." He never looked at her while saying it. She understood. She wasn't invited. 2 days later, Naomi burst into the shop holding her phone. "Are you aware your husband is trending locally?" Clara frowned. Naomi showed her a social page from a luxury venue. A pre-event promotional post. Rowe and Voss expansion celebration. Private guest list. The photo showed Ethan standing beside Camille. Close. Familiar. Public. Clara felt something inside her finally settle. Not shock, not heartbreak. Clarity. She called Leonard that evening. "I need your help," she said. A long pause answered. "I suspected you might." The celebration took place in the upper floor of a restored observatory overlooking the harbor. Glass dome ceiling, city lights reflecting upward like distant stars. Wealth gathered comfortably in tailored suits and low laughter. Ethan stood at the center beside Camille, not hiding now, not cautious, hosting. She wore ivory. Not emerald tonight. Symbolic. Ownership public. "To new beginnings," Camille announced to the guests. Glasses lifted. And at that exact moment, the elevator doors opened again. Conversation softened first, then stopped. Clara stepped out calmly in a midnight blue dress, not dramatic, not angry, composed. Beside her stood Leonard Graves. Guests turned toward Ethan, waiting for introduction. Ethan's face changed for the first time since Clara had ever known him. Not guilt. Fear. Camille frowned slightly. "I'm sorry, this is a private event." Leonard spoke gently. "Yes," he said. "Which is why it's important this is handled privately before it becomes public record." He handed her a document. Camille read. Color drained slowly from her expression. "Divorce filing never completed," Leonard explained to the room's attentive silence. "Meaning Mr. Rowe remains legally married to Ms. Voss, and therefore entered a second marriage invalidly." Clara held Ethan's gaze steadily. "You celebrated with your wife," she said quietly. "So I brought hers." The silence fractured into whispers. For the first time, Ethan had no controlled explanation prepared. After the guests dispersed into uncomfortable departure, Camille stood motionless staring at Ethan. "You told me it was processed," she said flatly. "You told me you didn't care about legal timing," he replied carefully. "I cared about ownership." She laughed once, sharp, humorless, then looked at Clara. "He lies efficiently," she said. "I didn't know about you." "I know," Clara answered softly. Camille studied her, then handed the unsigned divorce papers back to Leonard. "No," she said. "Now we do this properly." Ethan finally spoke toward Clara. "We can resolve this." She shook her head gently. It already is. Weeks later the shop reopened after brief closure. New signage, Bennett Floral Atelier. Ivy rearranged the window display while Naomi placed fresh pastries near the counter. Ruth stitched new curtains for the upstairs windows. A white rose sat alone in a glass cylinder. Unbound. Unneeded. The bell chimed. Leonard entered, this time without a folder. Habit, he said, noticing the rose. Memory, Clara corrected. He studied the shop, then her, as if confirming something had settled correctly. Coffee? She asked. Yes, he replied. Outside, rain began again, but lighter now, like a season changing rather than lingering. And for the first time since the first Friday a year ago. Clara did not wait for a pattern to return. She had built a new one instead. That's all for today. Like, subscribe, and see you in the next episode. Stay tuned.